So good evening, everybody. My name is Raven Davis. I am a ComLead alum as well as the Mission Engagement Associate for Sound Generations. Sound Generations is a nonprofit that supports people in King County on their aging journey through community connections and accessible services. I am responsible for community outreach efforts to enhance marketing services, as well as creating and sharing the stories of our clients to raise funds that support the programs that serve them. On behalf of ComLead, I'd like to welcome you to our student-run speaker series. Our topic tonight is storytelling for fundraising, a skill-building conversation. So it is a lovely evening here in Seattle, especially since it's not raining, at least I don't think so. So thank you all for joining us. I have a few announcements before we get started. We are recording tonight's conversation. If you have the bandwidth, please turn on your camera. It's always great to see your faces, but please keep your microphone off. And we will follow Jordan's talk with a Q&A session, so please type your questions into the chat box. I will then collect and pose questions to Jordan for a portion of our time together. So now let me introduce the speaker, Jordan Melagrana. All right, so Jordan is a graduate of the ComLead program and has been producing and directing videos and creative content for the past decade with an emphasis on stories that advocate for human rights. In 2016, he founded Block by Block Creative, where he continues building stories for organizations promoting conservation, criminal justice reform, voting access, education, equity, and civil rights. He's taught me everything I know about storytelling and communication for mission-driven organizations. So without further ado, Jordan, take it away.
Well, thank you, Raven. I seriously doubt I taught you everything you know about storytelling for mission-driven organizations, but I'll take the compliment either way. It's good to see you again. And thanks everybody for coming. I know jumping on Zoom and looking at some PowerPoint slides is probably something you've done all week or most of your week, so I appreciate you spending your Friday evening with us. Like Raven said, we're going to do a quick presentation and then hopefully leave most of the time for some discussion and some back and forth. I see some familiar names out there in Zoom land, so good to see you all again. Thanks for coming. As Raven said, I work for Block by Block Creative. That's my creative communications company based in Seattle, although we do work across North America. A lot of the work that we do, of course, includes awareness campaigns, advocacy campaigns, and fundraising. And when it comes to nonprofits, you're often doing all three of those things at the same time. So this talk this presentation is really building off a lot of the work that we've done both in advocacy and fundraising over the years for a variety of organizations. So the thing is, when you want to tell stories in any way for mission-driven organizations, it's really important to get stories from the communities that you represent. That's how you're going to make them authentic, and that's how they're going to be effective. I'm sure I'm not the first person you've heard to say that. It's nothing new. What is hard to do, though, is to figure out how exactly to get at those stories and make sure they're going to be the stories you're going to use to accomplish your goals. So the approach that we take at Block by Block, the approach that I try to use in the classes that I teach at the UW ComLead program, really focuses on a deliberate approach to get to those stories, a deliberate process to get to those stories. That's what we're going to talk a little bit about tonight. So there are going to be some PowerPoint slides up in front of you. There's going to be a couple moments, though, where I'm going to ask for your feedback. Please also keep your mics muted for that. Just utilize the chat box in those situations, and I'll try to respond from there. And then when we're complete with this presentation, then we'll open it up for questions, as Raven said. So give me just a moment. I'm going to share my screen, and then we'll get started. Okay. All right. So as we mentioned, this is storytelling for fundraising. And we use that word storytelling a lot. It's possibly the buzziest of buzzwords in the nonprofit world. We certainly use the word quite a bit in ComLead itself, and so I thought it might be appropriate for a moment just to talk about why in the world we say storytelling all the time, or we talk about stories all the time. And I think the simplest way to explain this is there's really no other option. Human brains are wired to think in narratives. Stories are the most effective way to reach humans. And that's why humans are communicating via stories all the time, all the time. So if we're not going to harness that power, then we're not going to be using the most effective tool at our disposal. One of the reasons, and there's lots of reasons for this, one of the reasons is because stories are more powerful and memorable than just facts alone. So it's not to say that facts aren't important, that data is not important, that when you communicate on behalf of your nonprofit, that those things aren't incredibly impactful. It's just that stories are going to be the thing that grab people, reach their heart and their mind at the same time. Again, this is probably something you've heard before, but it's worth repeating because it's going to influence every single thing we talk about tonight. So I'll give you an example. This is a fact from the Meals on Wheels website. Meals on Wheels delivers 221 million meals to 2.4 million seniors each year. That's great. That's fantastic. I would definitely talk about that if I worked for Meals on Wheels. It shows the breadth and depth of a lot of things that they do. But this is an example of telling a story just with a fact. Here's a fact. Hope you remember it. Hope you remember that it's a big number. There's another way to do it, though, which they have done on their Instagram page. So here's an example of an Instagram post. I'll read part of it to you. So this says, Shirley is 77 years old and lives in Dallas, Texas. With 22 grandkids, she loves having her family around her. 3 of her 4 children live nearby and stop by to check in on her when they can, but she relies on the local Meals on Wheels to bring her food when they cannot. Other health issues were compounded when heart problems led to the implant of a pacemaker. Some days it's even hard for her to get up. Luckily, her local Meals on Wheels program in Dallas is there to bring her the nutritious meals she needs to stay healthy. And then there's a quote. I've been staying in and trying to be safe during COVID-19, and Meals on Wheels has been bringing me food. I depend on my Meals on Wheels. So this is kind of doing the exact same thing. We're trying to tell the audience that there is that Meals on Wheels does, specifically by bringing meals to seniors. Except this time, we've got this fantastic photo, this winning grin, this wonderful person. We hear from her directly, and we get a hint of her story. I'm going to guess that this is going to stay with you a little bit more than that fact we said before, even though they're still trying to get at the same thing. And of course, that mutually exclusive, you could share both. But I highly, highly recommend that you focus on stories like this, particularly if you're communicating via social media. And that's for COVID times and non-COVID times alike. So when we talk about the stories that you're going to share, a lot of times when I work with clients, it's kind of like they had a brainstorm and it's like, we're going to get this person from our staff because they're really funny, and we're going to have them hold their phone up and they're going to record this video and we're going to put it on Instagram. It's going to be great. And maybe it might be. You may have been instinctually perfect and you put it out there and it goes viral and you raise a bunch of money and it's fantastic. That could happen. I'm not saying it couldn't. But what I would recommend is that if you're especially if you're starting from scratch, if you're trying to figure this out, there are a few things you need to figure out first to arrive at the story that you want to tell. This is going to be really helpful because in each of these situations, if you can figure this out, it'll help you make creative decisions on down the line. So the first one is your goal, what you're trying to do, your audience, who you're talking to, your message, what are you saying, your messengers, who's saying it, in your medium, how is that audience, what context they're going to receive that message. If you have an idea of what that's going to be, then you can arrive at the kind of story that you're going to tell. So let's talk about goals for a second. This is something I focus on quite a bit in my class. I think for the purposes of our conversation tonight, we can assume our goals are going to be fundraising. So you know what those are if you're working for an organization. Raise some percentage over last time, raise a certain amount of money, recruit a certain number of donors. You know your goals, but what we're really looking for here is the Goldilocks goal, which means it's ambitious, realistic, measurable, and impactful. It's a Goldilocks goal because those things can be a bit contradictory. So you want to be ambitious. You don't want to sell yourself short. You want to go out there and try to raise as much as you can or do as much as you think you can. You want to be realistic. You can't go out there and do something. You can't plan to do something that's really going to be unrealistic based on your past performance or your capacity. It needs to be measurable. In fundraising, it's pretty easy to set up measurements, how much money you're going to raise, number of donors recruited, that kind of thing. But just make sure you know what that is before you go into it. And then finally, impactful. Is the thing you're doing actually going to advance your mission? This is going to inform a lot of the choices you make. A quick example. If one of your goals, if you're a small nonprofit, if you decide that it's realistic to raise millions and millions of dollars off of this fundraising campaign, but your idea is to have a spokesperson from the local chapter of your organization that nobody's ever heard of before, I don't know if those two things will match up. But Maybe you have a celebrity spokesperson that you can work with. Then that makes a little bit more sense. If you have an ambitious goal like that to raise a lot of money, you need to get somebody more like that who might bring more eyeballs in. That's just one example. There's a bunch, but knowing your goal is going to help you figure out some of this stuff later on. All right. Who is your audience? Now you'll notice I put a question mark there and then I put an exclamation mark right next to it. That's because this is maybe the most important question you can ask yourself before you go out into the world. It's true for every communications campaign, it's really true for fundraising, is knowing who exactly that you're talking to. So let's take a little example. This is a post from the YMCA of Greater Seattle. And it's a picture of a young kid. He looks like he's at a school lunch. It says, "Hungry families are counting on us, donate today." And the share text says, "We're stepping up our hunger initiatives programs offered year-round to make sure kids and families still get healthy meals and snacks during the COVID-19 outbreak. We can only do this work with your help. Donate today and invest in the health and healing of our community." So this is where I'm going to ask you to use the chat box. And if you could just let me know what you think, who you think the audience is for this post. What's your guess based on seeing this? What I like about these answers is that they're really specific. Really specific to who might see this ad and might be affected by it. So new donors, existing donors, small dollar donors, large gift donors, local versus national donors. These are all things to consider to put it out there. So for example, we're talking about working parents with school-age children. Yeah, exactly. So we can also identify audiences by economics, demographics, geography, family, or living situations. And what I like about the answers that we're getting in the chat box right here is because we're looking at really what's specifically in the story that we're telling. We have a kid in school. That's probably going to appeal to a parent, more than likely. Seem to invite new people in. We have people who are likely to donate. Yeah, probably, probably so. But I would say people who are likely to donate are kind of who we're always after. So we can get even more specific than that. So mothers with kids that don't have to worry about where their next meal is. It's a very interesting answer, a very specific one. So what's great about this too is these are people who will intrinsically care about this issue, but also might have the money to actually donate. That's probably the audience they had in mind when they did that. But the things you always have to ask yourself, and this is not always the easiest thing to do when you talk about audiences. Oh, people are saying, is my connection breaking up a little bit? For the people on video, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay? Thumbs up, okay. So the questions you're always asking yourself when you talk about audiences, and it's not always easy, what do they value? Why should they care? And what will motivate them? Always, always, always ask yourself that question. I'm sure that will come up in our discussion later, but always come back to these three basic questions. All right. So messages, this is what we're talking about. In the case of COVID, this is the big question, I think. There's all kinds of things we could talk about with messaging, but right now it's how or if to talk about COVID. It's a really tough thing, right? It's on everybody's mind, so it might make sense to talk more about it since it's already front of mind for folks. On the other hand, are people sick of it? And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean simply they hear about it all the time, thinking about it all the time. It can be exhausting. So do you add to that by continuing to talk about it? I can't answer that question. That's going to be up to you and who your audiences are and what you think, the position that you think that they're in. But it's certainly something it's worth considering. I came across this quote the other day that I thought actually spoke really well to this moment that we're in. And I'll just read it real quick. In the coming weeks and months, successful requests for charitable donations will need to be embedded in a larger expression of mutual support, empathy, and solidarity. So that's Alan Cantor. He's a nonprofit consultant. I thought this kind of hit the nail on the head. That if you are going to talk about COVID, that this is the way you talk about it. That you link the issues that you're already working on with how COVID has affected that and recruit people to your cause. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. This is a post from World Water Day 2020. World Water Day happens every year. Most of the time on World Water Day, we're talking about who has access to clean water, who has access to plumbing, that kind of thing. This year, they put out this post, which says, the families we serve are some of the most vulnerable to coronavirus in America. They struggle to wash their hands and bodies. And it goes on to talk about the lack of running water. What they're talking about in the story here is the Navajo Nation, where 30% of families don't have running water in their homes. I actually got to see this up close and personal about a month ago to really understand how impactful that is in a situation where the number one health advice that you have is to wash your hands, and yet you don't have the water to do it. So this is an example of, we're still talking about water. We're still talking about the importance of running water, the same thing that World Water Day would be doing anyway, but contextualizing it within the virus, giving people one more reason to care about this particular issue. I thought it was a pretty good synergy and speaks to the idea of solidarity. So the messengers, so who should be telling the story anytime you're putting out something in the world? And I should mention that, we've been talking about social posts here, photos, could be videos, could be a blog post, could be an email. It doesn't matter what the medium is. We still have a messenger of some kind. So who should be telling the story that you're trying to tell? It's a question that everyone should ask before they go out. What you're looking for is a person or people who have these four qualities. So authenticity, authority, representation, and access. What I mean by that is authenticity. Will people believe that this person has had that lived experience or has had a professional experience? Do they have an authentic connection to the issue at hand? The authority, this is really simple. Will the audience believe them based on their bona fides or something about them? Do they have the authority to talk about it? Representation, are they actually representing the communities that you're talking about? And then finally, access. Can you actually have this messenger involved in your video? So in each of those examples, a lot of times people will go to, especially nonprofits will say, well, we'll pick someone from our staff, or we'll have our ED deliver a message. There's nothing inherently wrong about that. In fact, that might be the exact right messenger depending on your audience. But I would take a step back if that's your first go-to to think about, does that person have authenticity, authority, representation, and access? Do they have 2 out of the 3 or 2 out of the 4 or 3 out of the 4? Is there someone else that you could recruit from perhaps your clients or your staff or your volunteers that might be a better messenger that more represents the issues that you're trying to talk about? So I'll give you a brief example of that. This is a video from Big, was put out during a fundraising video, but I think it kind of gives you an idea of what we're talking about.
Hello everyone, my name is Fabiola Ramirez. I am a Big with Big Brothers and Big Sisters. This is my little Abigail. This is a picture of us when we went on our first hangout, which was to Fresno State. Because of the COVID-19 crisis, we have not been able to hang out, yet we still remain connected, whether it's through phone or text. She's still a little bit shy about FaceTiming, but something I did for her that I think is very special is I went ahead and delivered some books to her. Huge shout out to Reading Heart, who was able to provide those books. I left them outside her door and she was able to start reading them right away, which is huge for her because she loves reading. And right now with school not being in session, there was no other way she could get access to books. There are a lot of simple little things we can do for them that, trust me, they're going to enjoy, appreciate, and at the same time, you just remind them, even if it's through books, that you're there for them.
Okay, so the reason I showed you that is, look who's the messenger in this video, right? It's not staff, it's not somebody who doesn't have this experience. This is, you've kind of two options. You have a big sisters, and she talked about her little, who was a little shy on FaceTime, so it's kind of not surprising that she's not in the video. This spokesperson has all those things I was talking about: authenticity, authority, representation, and access. The other thing I love about this video is that it looks like it was shot on her home webcam for the most part. This was not a complex video, this wasn't expensive, but you can see how this communicates specifically during COVID, how the important work that Big Brothers Big Sisters is doing continues. You could easily attach a fundraising ask to this. So now we're going to talk about Medium. So again, this is the context in which your audience is going to receive your story. It could be video, audio, graphics, email, website, like I mentioned before. Any of those things are totally appropriate. All these same rules apply. You have to decide who your audience is, where are they, how do you get to them? Are they folks who use Instagram a lot? Maybe it's a good time to use a photo. Are they folks on Twitter? Maybe you want to write a blog post and share it. Are they on your email list? Write a story in your email. This is really important because the context in which people receive that story might change the way in which you format it. So I'll make one little pitch, is that there is, you may have noticed, quite an uptick in the amount of videos that are being shared, or video events that are happening since the pandemic began. Certainly not an accident. Both people are at home more, they're online more, they're watching more videos. And I also suspect that the people who make videos, I'm one of those people, are probably making more because they're at home and they're in front of their computers, and that's kind of what we do for a living. So there's a ton of video content out there. But this has been studied. Adobe just did a big study about what gets engagements online. And video came right to the top again. This is a quote from one of the digital insight managers at Adobe. There's one lesson overall that COVID-19 has taught us about content. It's that digital video is playing a more permanent role in everyday lives of consumers today. So that is a pitch for trying to do video one way or the other, whether it's a more professional produced video or one of the ones I just showed you that's a little more grassroots. The algorithms don't care, Facebook doesn't care, and the audience will receive a video kind of either way. So the things you have to think about when you pick your medium, though, is not just about your audience, it's about you, your capacity. Can you do this? Certainly cost is a factor. The audience, the message, and the messenger. Is your messenger someone that you can get on a Zoom call to record a message, or are they unavailable and they won't be able to do that, for example, in a video? Would it be easier to get a quote from them to put in something written? Things to think about. And then, of course, distribution. So one thing I wanted to mention, too, is that while video reigns supreme, it's not the only way to tell a story. And so here's a really good example from Boys and Girls Club. Affecting image. We're talking to the exact population Boys and Girls Club wants to talk to. He's wearing a mask, so we know we're talking about COVID. So instantly this image is going to be relevant. And then on the right, it says, back to school looks different this year. Education gaps are widening and kids in need are even more vulnerable of falling behind. Donate now to ensure every child has equal access to a great future. So again, synergy of the COVID situation, what Boys and Girls might be fundraising for anyway, really putting those two things together. But they didn't produce a video, they didn't write a long blog post. They took a photo that may have been in their library from earlier this year and just wrote some new share text to tell that story. So it doesn't always have to be a super elaborate project. Distribution is one thing to really think about. What context your audience is seeing something. So if you're putting something out on Instagram, make it a minute long. It's on Facebook, maybe a couple minutes long, for example, if you're talking about video length. I'll give you one example from some work we did this year for a group called Move and Voter Project. So this is a group that raises a lot of money from big dollar donors, and then takes that money and redistributes it to voter engagement groups, smaller grassroots groups all across the country. So in their case, they already had online fundraisers set up. So they had captive audiences, much like you are right now. So they knew they had people who could sit for a longer session. They weren't waiting for people to scroll by. So because of that, we were able to make a 12-minute video that really went in depth on each of the groups that we were trying to profile. Talked a lot about how the volunteers and the grassroots leaders' personal motivations to vote, gave them a really full, rich story, and we're able to share that inside of these fundraising events. That video is available publicly, but for social media, we also did a 2-minute and a 1-minute video that could be shared on Facebook and Instagram and all the rest, because that's a different audience we were trying to reach, the different medium that people were receiving it in. Combination of these efforts was really successful. We helped raise over $500,000 for those groups during this election cycle. which is huge for those little grassroots groups. And it's because I think we made good choices about what the goals were, where we were going to show the video, how we picked it, and the stories that we decided to tell. So now we've gone through the things you have to think about ahead of time. Now you come up with the stories you want to tell. What do you have in front of you? What do you want to make? How do you tell this? So 3 adjectives really try to keep in mind: short, simple, and authentic. If you can come up with stories that get those 3 things across, that's really helpful. You have to really emphasize the short part. As I mentioned, a lot of people are online. There's a lot of stuff to shift through. You'll do yourself a favor the shorter you are, unless you're in a situation like I described with that kind of captive audience. Simple, that simply means don't get caught in the weeds. Tell the story from beginning to end. Don't get caught up. Don't throw a bunch of acronyms at people. Don't get into every little piece of detail. Stick to the simple story at the heart of it. Stick to the characters. And then authentic, which again goes back to the messengers that you decide to pick, people that you recruit from, your constituents, your volunteers, your staff, etc. Make sure that it is authentic so that it rings true. Here's a suggestion. If you're going to do a story in this time period, this is a really, really easy story structure to start with. And you saw it in some of the examples that I did before. The need in our community continues during the pandemic. So in other words, reminding people that what was a problem before, that hasn't gone away just because this other thing is still a news cycle and is affecting tons of people. Things like clean water still matter. Things like equal education still matter. It still happens during the pandemic. Then a little bit about what you're doing. This is how we've pivoted, and everybody's sick of that word, but this is how we've pivoted to continue our work. So we know it's still important. We've had to change the way we're doing things, but we're still out there and we're still doing it. And then finally, kind of always a good rule when fundraising is to ask the audience to help, to recruit them, to say that they're the ones that can make this important work happen through donation. So this is not super different from how it would be outside of COVID, but this is one way to kind of a story now that we're in the situation and get that synergy of the issues you're working on and how it intersects with the pandemic's effect on people's lives. So here's another example. It's another really short video.
While we remain inside, social distancing, isolating ourselves away from people, we are helping protect the ones we love, the ones who are most vulnerable. But not all of us can stay inside. Some have to be on the front lines, responding to older Americans who are most in need, delivering food and basic necessities, making sure the growing list of seniors who feel most alone right now hear a knock at the door and know that they are not. And though we may all feel vulnerable right now, there is so much strength to be found in this moment we're in. The outpouring of courage and support that is helping seniors and showing us all in these uncertain times that humanity is winning. Heroes across every community making a big difference right now. An army of Meals on Wheels volunteers and staff rising to the challenge in difficult times, the same way we've responded for decades in better times. Please remember the millions of homebound seniors who are depending on us. Donate now at mealsonwheelsamerica.org/COVID-19.
So even if that particular video is not your cup of tea, aesthetically, you can see that there's a story structure there very similar to the one that I laid. Very direct, very easy story to follow. Seniors are at home, they need food, Meals on Wheels delivers that food. You can help by donating. You also notice there were no facts in that. Okay. So one last thing that I want to talk about is your approach. If everyone makes the exact same video, obviously nothing is going to break through. So what are some ways that you can kind of shake things up? I know this sounds easier than it will be to accomplish, but do something different than everybody else is doing. Make a different music choice, feature different people, shake it up. do take a different medium, look at what other people are doing and do something different, literally for the sake of doing something different, just so people see something new on their feeds. And the next two are kind of lessons that I learned, which I'll share with you in just a moment, which is lean into the stories that are right in front of you. So if you have people on your staff who can speak authentically, ask them to help out, ask them to tell their story. If you have clients you work with, ask them to tell their story. If they're right there in front of you, let's do that rather than looking around for a long time to find the perfect thing. And then last, follow the lead of the community to support and the people on your staff. And I'll give you an example of this. This is not a COVID example, but a few years ago, I founded a program called Rooted in Rights, which is a media advocacy program formed by people with disabilities. We were coming up to Giving Tuesday, and we're like, oh, we should probably make a Giving Tuesday video. What should we do? And we thought about it, and we went through this kind of exercise. We weren't really coming up with much. So like, let's just go for it. Let's see what happens. And then this is the video that we came up with for Giving Tuesday.
Rooted in Rights makes a Giving Tuesday video. Emily Ladau confidently speaks to camera.
This Giving Tuesday, we ask you to consider donating to Rooted in Rights. There are 3 ways you can do so. What is it? Help me out here. Why can't I do
You're
this?
not the right person to be doing this.
No, come on. I can do it. I think I remember everything. Whew.
Rooted in Rights tries to make a Giving Tuesday video.
You can buy one of our films on video on demand.
I can say that. There are 3 easy ways that you can support us. You can go to Vimeo to download one of our 3 films, On the Outs, Right to be Rescued, and Bottom Dollars. I forgot. No.
You can become a patron on our Patreon page to support the Storyteller series.
Okay. You can become a patron by visiting our Patreon page to support the Storyteller series, or go to rootedinrights.org/donate.
Emily rubs her fingers together.
I need those dollars. Okay. Thank you.
We produced award-winning films. Here are a few highlights.
We need to show cities that,
This is unfathomable. This is unfathomable. This is unfathomable to me. Opening it. Bleh. Nope. I don't know. You just made me laugh the whole time.
We promise we're good at this.
This is what? Nope. Car. Just cut it. There's someone yelling.
But we clearly can't do it without you.
we need your help.
Rooted in Rights logo. rootedinrights.org/donate.
All right. Well, that's the conclusion of the slides portion of the evening. Stop sharing.
Okay, so far we have one question. This is a question from Hannah, and it says, when do you recommend including a direct fundraising message in a story versus choosing not to include one?
It's a good question, and it comes up quite a bit. I would say that almost always include the message in the video or story or whatever you're writing. And the reason for that is you may only have one shot at reaching the donors at this exact moment. Why leave that out? Why leave that to chance? It may be that they read your story or see your story and are so motivated by your message that they go to your website and donate. I would just ask them, embed it in the story.
Okay. Well, I have a couple questions. I see there's no other questions in the chat, and now my eyes are going blurry, so I cannot see what I wrote. Oh, well, this is a good one. All right. So it is an election year, and a lot of nonprofits are competing with politicians for donations. What kind of messaging could organizations put out to reclaim the attention of donors and garner new donors?
I think the easiest answer is that, at least at the moment, you're not going to. It's not only election year, it's probably a bigger than ever election year. And especially as we get closer to November 3rd, it's kind of all anyone's going to be thinking about. So I don't think that you can really divert their attention in a huge way, not yet anyway, probably after the election and hopefully. But the same goes with the pandemic. When you have a story, largely like a meta story like the election that everyone is talking about all the time, that their feeds are full of all the time, there's an opportunity to talk about something different. And this election is pretty nasty. It's probably going to get nastier in the next couple of weeks. So sometimes you can just break away and just do something different. If everyone's going negative, you go the other way. And I'll give you an example. When the coronavirus first hit and people were first dealing with being at home and being scared and not knowing what was going on and not really understanding what was happening, I still work for a conservation campaign. And so we were a little struggling, like, what do we put out into the world during this? Like, what can we be helpful with at this point? We're not a public health organization. We don't have good advice to give. What should we do? And so what we did is we actually just took a video that was intended just to be a banner video for our Facebook page. And it really is just scenery similar to the stuff that's like behind me, drone shots of the forest. And we just put that out into the world. And it was one of our most watched videos on Twitter that month, because people were so anxious to get away from the stress and get away from the scariness and just watch this peaceful thing. And that was something we could contribute because we were a conservation campaign. And we were able to, that wasn't a fundraising ask, but we still got attention away from the largest story in the world because of that. So when it comes to political elections, it's the same thing. If you're seeing something get dominated, go the opposite way. See if you can get people to think about something else, because there's probably a decent number of people out there who would like to.
I have another question that directly affects me in my job in the organization I work for. So our donor profile for larger gifts are made up of people in the same age group as the clients that we serve. And so we are trying to find ways to appeal to the younger crowd, especially since we're about supporting aging adults and everyone is aging. So how can we get younger people to care?
Well, I think so. This happens occasionally where people have this kind of question. And my question back is always, do you need young people? Like, why do you want young people involved?
Well, shoot, younger people are making a lot of money nowadays. It's kind of weird to have, we actually have some donors that actually like get some of our services, like Meals on Wheels, for instance. There's Meals on Wheels clients that send money, donations for other aging adults, other adults with disabilities to get meals from Meals on Wheels. So, you know, if there were younger folks, and not, we're looking at probably like mid to late 20s and maybe to like 40s to help donate, you know, because that may be their grandparent, you know, that may need a meal. Or we also have other services as we focus on food security, transportation, health and wellness. So they may need a ride somewhere, and you know, that young adult may not be available to take their grandparent or, you know, great aunt or whoever somewhere. Donating to help support those services can help benefit them in the King County area. So that's kind of why we're like, how do we get to them? And we're still struggling.
Well, there's a lot going on in this particular example, because it sounds like the first hurdle you have is even making the service relevant to that particular age group. It's not necessarily an immediate thing that people think about, unless they are helping with caregiving for an elderly person in their family. So I think that's the first hill you kind of have to climb, is figure out how would you get people to be interested in that. And then also, you know, talk a little bit more about what your goal is there. Are you trying to get younger people involved just because you think you can raise money more from that demographic? Or do you want something a little bit more? Like, do you want more active involvement in a non-fundraising way to be involved in the organization more broadly? And even in what you just said, there's plenty of stories I could pull out of what you just said. That whole thing of like, you know, you want to help out your great aunt, but you got to go to class. You can't be there all the time. Well, we can. So if you donate, then we can take care of that. And that makes, you know, I think there's definitely some appeals there for sure.
Okay, we have another question from Rini that says, have you had to film interviews with community members through Zoom or video calls? And do you have any tips for virtual video making?
Yeah, so we have to do that quite a bit. I was somewhat fortunate in that I was already doing this a lot before the pandemic, simply because a lot of the folks I worked with lived in very remote areas. So we were kind of experimenting with this ahead of time. You know, it's not ideal in a lot of ways, simply because there's a lot of people on Zoom all the time. So how much are they going to watch your recorded Zoom conversation afterwards? I don't know. I've been surprised by that. So what you want to do is really, not worry so much about the quality and really focus on the content itself. So in the same way that a Zoom conversation kind of always looks like this, try something else. Don't have someone sitting in their living room, have them go outside, maybe have them walk around, maybe try something visually completely different. Again, it goes back to really good casting of your messengers. If you have compelling people, it kind of won't matter what medium that you present them in, whether it's Zoom or something else. So I guess another part of that question, when you are recording Zoom, just make sure you're doing it at the best quality. Certainly you use, you can repurpose old content. That's you saw that in some of the ads I showed you tonight. Some of those shots of the elderly folks in the Meals on Wheels ad, I saw in at least several other Meals on Wheels videos. So they're definitely reusing that stock that they have. Nothing wrong with that. This is the time to do that. You also might be able to recruit community members to film themselves. So rather than relying on Zoom, have someone take their phone and record themselves or their family members if that's the story you're trying to get. That's all very possible if you have the capacity to get that video and then do something creative with it on your end.
Okay, there is a follow-up question to my question, and it is, do you have any suggestions or recommendations if our target audience is broad? So for example, aging from 18 to 70 years old. And also, is there any strategy that we can use to target them?
Probably. It really depends. It's hard to answer that question not knowing what the issue is or what you're trying to do. But I would say just at first glance, that is a massively broad audience. And if you can, I would design stories that would break off pieces of that might be more effective, say 18 to 24 and over 55 than it would be to try to do it at the same time in the same story or same video or same post. The nice part about communicating digitally is you don't have to do it all at once. The video you post today is not going to be the last one that you ever put up there. So I would certainly try to break it down into different smaller pieces where you can design a more specific story if you can.
Okay, there's another question in the chat box. It says, one of the key aspects of a good story, as you mentioned, is access, which can be difficult in normal times, but especially difficult now in COVID times. If any orgs want to focus on community members, do you have any recommendations for using community-generated footage in terms of getting a good story? Not just production value, but on story elements.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so this is something that I care very, very much about, and pre-COVID as well, is how can you get people from the communities you're serving involved in the telling of the story? So it's not just about them, but it's also by them. And one way you can do that in the COVID era that's actually somewhat advantageous is that if people are quarantined, they might have time to talk to you and actually collaborate with you on something. So in, quote unquote, normal times, where people might be, on the move and hard to get a hold of, there might be more time for collaboration. So what do I mean by that is you can take what we went through tonight and talk about it with those community members and ask them what is the message that you really want to get out there? Who should be the person who says that? Have this conversation with those community members, in a chat like this. Co-create it, basically, is really what I'm talking about here. And then once you figure out what you want to do, then maybe you can recruit them to actually do some of that work for you. Like I said, with an iPhone or a smartphone, people can shoot video, people can take photos. If you don't want to do something like that, people can write their own stories. And you as the nonprofit or as the communications professional can support them in doing that, can help them if they're not used to doing that kind of thing. But it's a great opportunity to start bringing those authentic stories right into the office where maybe you might not have had the time or the ability to do that before.
Okay, so I have another question. When you were talking about approach, how do you get creative when you're telling the same story? So like our organization, we focus on food security, which includes Meals on Wheels. And a lot of people just know us for Meals on Wheels, but we also have like community dining, the transportation services, and like caregiver support and things like that. But if we don't have a client that has like this super extraordinary story and a lot of their stories are similar, how can we get creative with that?
Yeah, so that can happen. But I would suggest that the stories maybe aren't as similar as you think they are. If you know that, the old saying, truth is stranger than fiction, it's absolutely true. And I think if you dig in a little deeper with some of the folks you're talking about, you may find a different story. Because sometimes what happens is you go into it thinking, excuse me, you go into it kind of with a preconceived notion of what that story is going to be. And so that person that you're talking to, that community member, might sense that and sort of give you what you want, basically. So what I would suggest is kind of backing up a little bit. And again, in a co-creation kind of way, ask them, what do you think would convince people to donate? What do you think would get people involved? What do you think people would care about? And try to poll people a little bit more, dig a little deeper on those stories. I think you'll start to find quite a bit of difference. And don't be afraid to do those idiosyncrasies and be really specific. Like the Instagram post I showed you, that's not the same story. Not everyone's going to have a story like that. And so try to find those elements that make it unique. That's what's going to pop.
Okay. So I have another question. So our partner sites and clients have been heavily impacted by COVID. How can you go and just in general, an organization or whoever, go about crafting a message that encourages people to donate without badgering them or constantly reminding them that COVID is impacting this population?
Well, so we kind of talked about that earlier. You can kind of make a choice whether or not you're going to do that. The downside is, yeah, you're going to exhaust people. They might tune you out if they've heard too much about it. On the other hand, it's relevant. And so it may be important to include that story. I think you used the word badgering or
yeah.
So that speaks to kind of tone and approach too. So it's not that COVID needs to be the main character in whatever story you're telling, but it's also kind of weird to not acknowledge it's happening in a lot of these stories. So Meals on Wheels, and I'll use the example again, they deliver food all the time, right? With COVID or not, but in COVID, it makes it a lot harder. You saw the volunteers, with masks and face shields on and gloves, and it's different. It just is. And so avoiding it might just seem a little odd in terms of the story you're trying to tell. On the other hand, if you really think your audience is exhausted and really wants to talk about something else, then maybe go that direction. It's not something I can answer in a vacuum. It really has, again, to do with whom you're talking to and kind of where they're at emotionally.
Okay, so we have a question from Remy, and it says, is it too broad to tell a story about how COVID-19 has impacted the industry as a whole before your organization's specific call to action? For example, education, retail, etc.
No, I don't think so. I mean, it depends on what you mean by that. So the example I showed earlier with the young boy with the mask on, that share text actually starts by, school looks different this year. Right, that's the first sentence or something like that. So right, obviously that's not a long part of the story, but it's kind of acknowledging that in a broad sense, school is very, very different. We all know that. We all know what that means. We don't actually have to tell you, well, teachers are worried about going in and kids are scared and they're learning from home and all the challenges. Like, people know that because maybe they're parents. Like, we don't have to tell them all that. They get it. So a brief reminder, yeah, school is different. Then how is this specifically affecting the issue that you're working on? I think that's totally fine. I wouldn't spend too much time on it, but in terms of stage setting, it seems like a good idea depending on the story you're trying to tell.
Okay, well, I guess we can start wrapping up. So I have just a few announcements as we wrap up. So this is our first event of the CommLead Fall Event Series. I want to say thanks to all 5 members of the CommLead COVID Consultancy. That is Susan, Stacia, Ryan, Mo, and Hannah, but especially Evelyn for excellent work putting this event together. Thanks to Mo for tech support and her help facilitating our Q&A. Thanks to Alex Stonehill, our CommLead Head of Creative Strategy, for his leadership with the COVID Consultancy. We will be sending out the video capture of tonight, a short takeaway, and a brief survey, so keep an eye out for these items in your inbox. If this kind of conversation appeals to you, consider pursuing a graduate degree with CommLead. You can visit our website to learn more about our program. If you are in need of pro bono communication consulting, please connect with COVID Consulting. The link to our website will be added in the chat.
Do you have advice on how to convey a strong message without making the donor the hero in the story while still compelling them to give?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the donor as hero motif, certainly kind of bedrock communication idea, certainly something people use all the time. Honestly, I don't know if you can get away from it entirely, but it's a matter of emphasis. So actually the clip I showed from Meals on Wheels does that pretty well, because in that video, the volunteers are obviously the heroes. They're the ones doing the work. They're the ones who the story is kind of about. And yes, at the end, we still do the fundraising ask, but it's not all about, only you have the power to make this change. Only you, if you donate, will change the world, all because of the money that you can give us. So I think it is a matter of emphasis more than anything. And I'm not as huge a fan of making the donor the hero, although I understand the necessity of that sometime. So I think it really is just a matter of emphasis. I think it's totally probably not only good, but better to center the stories around either the communities that you're serving or possibly your volunteers or wherever your story is going, something like that.
Okay, so I guess we'll wrap up for real this time. Are there any other questions, like last minute questions or anything in the chat? Nope. Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and thank you, Jordan, for giving us information that we need for fundraising.
Absolutely. I put my email address in the chat box. Feel free to reach out if you have additional questions. And if you got your ballot in the mail and it's sitting on your dining room table, please fill it out and mail it in. There's only a few days left. Thanks.